On the Russian side, it appears that very many of their people are getting the most basic training, very patchy provision of equipment, and they're also pushing injured or unwell personnel back into the front line in some of these assault forces where the quality is incredibly low. But as I said, there are other parts of the Russian forces which are a bit more privileged, particularly those associated with the drone operators, where there is a high degree of training and a lot of sharing lessons. So they too have a very uneven force, and they are increasingly bringing in overseas, if you like, volunteers, but it turns out that in many cases that they've been tricked into serving. I think we've seen stuff recently about people coming in from Africa who suddenly find themselves on the front line. It's a lot of different tricks to basically deal with their own personnel issues.
Hello and welcome to Frontline with me, Kate Chabot. And this time we are joined by Matthew Savill. Matthew is the Director of Military Sciences at the London-based think tank RUSI. He focuses on developments and trends in modern conflict. He worked as a civil servant for 20 years, mainly at the MOD, and was on the Operations and Crisis team in 2022 in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Matthew, welcome back to Frontline. It's great to see you again.
Good to see you as well.
So we've got a lot to talk about today. Can we just start, though, by giving us your overview at the moment of the situation on the battlefield in Ukraine?
Well, where we are is that the Russians on the ground are largely speaking the ones who are on the offensive, but it is a very slow and costly offensive. But I would say that they're not really prioritizing necessarily the capture of territory so much as inflicting damage and casualties on the Ukrainians as part of an overall attempt to essentially convince everybody that Russian victory is inevitable, and that therefore supports their information campaign aimed at getting other countries, particularly the US, to reduce or end their support for Ukraine. So there is this grinding attritional conflict going on, and that is being combined with this continued air and long-range strike campaign on the Russian side, which, particularly because it's so cold right now, is aimed at hitting Ukrainian civilians, cutting the power, doing damage that way. And I think at certain points, only about 60% of Ukrainian power generation needs are being met at the moment. There are significant blackouts and shortfalls. The Ukrainians, for their part, are largely speaking operationally on the defensive, and they are trying to manage this issue of shortfalls in personnel along the front and in their overall mobilization. And they have combined that with their own deep strike campaign aimed at Russian military industry and Russian energy supplies, and hitting the Russian economy, as well as some, if you like, local counterattacks. Kupiansk is the best example of this, which demonstrates that they can still muster forces, but overall, they are in a position where they're, broadly speaking, on the defensive in spite of some of this local activity. So the war overall, some might characterize it as static. There is actually quite a lot of dynamic activity happening around the front as both sides are seeking to either press home particular, if you like, propaganda points, and also work out where the front line is in the context of the so-called negotiations and peace talks that are underway.
You said that both sides are trying to push propaganda points. What is the Ukrainian interest? You've outlined what the Russian interest is. What about the Ukrainian interest in that?
I think the Ukrainian interest is a couple of particular areas. One is that they are still in this fight and they are still fighting, and they are capable of holding the Russians. Now, as I said, there's a question as to whether right now the Russians are really prioritizing large advances that they're not capable of so much as casualties. But the Ukrainians are slowing them up. So we've talked for a long time about Pokrovsk. There is still fighting in and around Pokrovsk, even though the Russian operation to capture that started probably a year ago now and has come at enormous expense. The downside is the Russians have effectively destroyed it and depopulated it. They are trying to do the same in other areas where they are striking into Ukrainian cities. And so the Ukrainians want to demonstrate that they can still defend them. They want to hold the Russians back so that they can't get in range, say, of Zaporizhia with their artillery, because then they can begin striking that. And I think there's a particular issue which is around the Donbass, which is that the Ukrainians will want to emphasize that there is no way that they should be giving up territory there to the Russians, given that even if they continue to advance, maybe pick up pace on the Russian side, it might still be more than another year before they have taken the rest of the territory that is in those oblasts. And the Ukrainians, it's in their interest to point that out, because the Russian position seems to be, this is inevitable, so why don't you just give it to us anyway?
And the first trilateral talks have just taken place involving Ukraine, the US and Russia. Do you have an idea or a theory as to why now?
I don't really. I wouldn't say I have the kind of political insight necessary to divine what's going on there. We might infer from what has come out publicly that this is, to a degree, a product of the Russians stringing the process out. They don't want to completely disengage from it, because there's a danger that that prompts a change of heart in the US administration. It gives grist to the mill of those who I would think would rightly argue that Russian engagement is disingenuous. So they need to engage enough to give the impression that they are sincere, and they want to transfer the responsibility back onto the Ukrainians for progress or not being made. And I think that forces the Ukrainians to engage on these uncomfortable terms, which are in many respects negative in terms of their interests.
And the assessment in an article by the Financial Times this week is that without a significant change on the battlefield, there will be no change in the thinking of anyone involved in these talks. Do you agree? And what change on the battlefield do you think could make a difference?
It is difficult to know in terms of the latter. If there was a significant breakthrough in either direction at the moment, that would be more likely to be from the Russian side, although that doesn't mean it's very likely. That would heap pressure on the Ukrainians to try and arrange a ceasefire to consolidate their position and steady their lines. I think what's in the back of their minds and everybody else's is the view that even if there is a ceasefire, it is quite likely that there will be a Russian attempt down the line to have another go. Although I think the Russians are having to accept that their original aim of remove the government, dominate Ukraine through some kind of puppet or more amenable government is on hold at the moment. But their fallback position is to basically do so much damage that the Ukrainian economy is effectively existing only with the sufferance of the Russians. That in essence, that Ukraine itself has to come to some kind of arrangement with the future of Russia that makes it more pliable. I think for the Ukrainians, what they are really hoping for is more significant pressure inside Russia. And I don't mean a public uprising. I mean the fact that at a certain point, the Russian economy will begin to take real damage from these hits to energy and refining capacity, that their reserves are not endless, and that actually the Russians don't quite have the stamina that they are presenting. I mean, we should be clear that the Russians are able to recruit to cover their losses at the moment. That comes at increased cost, but they are still hitting those recruitment targets. But their main trick is to basically argue that they can break the Ukrainians sooner than they themselves will face pain. So that is the narrative battle that is underway.
But in terms of the cost to Russia, the Centre for Strategic and International Studies has said as a result of the war, Russia is in decline as a major power. How long do you think Russia can sustain the war, given the human and the financial cost?
I don't know which to duck it. I mean, that's the great unknown, because it's not a static target. So I think we just over a year ago were looking at the expenditure of Russian equipment and their ability to refurbish equipment. And the vast majority of Russian equipment was old, but being refurbished. And our view then was that their loss rates meant that they would begin to really struggle towards the end of 2025. What actually happened was that they were able to eke out a bit more time. They've increased their military industrial capacity. They are producing a few more of these longer range cruise missiles and ballistic missiles. Chinese components have helped them stave off some of the problems. There are still Western components that are evading sanctions somehow and getting into country. And so the Russians have adopted their tactics and tweaked their industrial base to basically keep going, even though it is very expensive. So knowing when they, in military terms, really begin to fall on their knees is difficult to know. Economically, the price of oil, of course, is one of the big factors, and the challenge there is that whilst their economy has come under severe pressure, and opinions do vary on at what point it becomes unsustainable, the price of oil per barrel hasn't quite hit the low that it needs to really cause alarm. And so they are storing up all sorts of trouble for themselves in the long term, from a geopolitical, a strategic position, the long-term health and viability of Russia as a state. But their military system can just about keep going at the moment.
And we are fast approaching the 4th anniversary of the full-scale invasion. How would you characterize the war in 2026 compared to the way it was after the full-scale invasion in 2022? It's
gone through a number of changes. So we've had classic, relatively fast maneuvering warfare. We've moved to a stage where there are a lot of trenches and definable front lines. 2025, I think, when our researchers have looked at this, was characterized by a blurring of the front lines. So, this discussion about, trenches and people digging in was still there, but the battlefield was changing again. And that's because both sides are adapting to each other's tactics. So looking ahead to 2026, I don't know if I would say what will be the defining characteristic. But for example, we've seen an increase in battlefield transparency. That makes it harder to mass forces. That means people have to maneuver differently. They assemble differently. It's harder to concentrate force. A lot of that has been from small drones in the air. Ground drones have increasingly come into play, and we'll probably see a lot more of them on the ground. A lot will depend if the Ukrainians do fix their mobilization and personnel issues. And then there is an awful lot going on in the air in terms of how each side is trying to use their air forces to either strike deep or support their ground forces. That could change again, depending on how the balance of those capabilities plays out. So we're in this phase at the moment where there's been a blurring of the lines, and very small numbers of infantry are infiltrating between those lines, and it's been largely defensive from the Ukrainians. If they want to change the course of the war, they need to now be able to assemble offensive forces again and work out how they use those scarce resources to really dislocate the Russians.
And on the transparency of the battlefield, people often describe that as being one of the most challenging aspects of this war. What does it mean exactly? And how has that impacted what soldiers can and can't do?
Yeah, when we talk about battlefield transparency, what we are mostly talking about in shorthand is how much of the battlefield can you see, at what range can you detect adversary forces, how reliable is the information, and how quickly can you use it to then target those forces. And we've talked about battlefield transparency because it has increased largely as a result of the massive growth in the volume of sensors that are on the battlefield that are being controlled by the units that are on the battlefield. This is predominantly small drones that are operated by units. In the past, lots of surveillance drones are, if you like, operated by a higher headquarters, and then information is passed down the chain. There is also some improvement in commercial satellite imagery, which provides quality and speed of access that would have been unheard of 20 years ago, but that's only a small part of it. And so units can now see more directly and bring in their firepower with greater precision as well because of the proliferation of these drones. I should say, though, the transparency is not total and it's not static, as in it is constantly being contested and pushed back. And that's because it's affected by a number of factors that change. The first is the quality and control of the electromagnetic spectrum. There is weather, which can, if it's mistier, that affects electro-optical sensors. So you might need more infrared sensors. It's foliage, which changes throughout the year. There is adversary tactics. People are coming up with different ways to camouflage themselves or different ways of using deception, or they are dispersing their forces more. And so what that means is the level of transparency goes up and down as each side adjusts and adapts. So the overall trend is it's harder to move without being detected. It is easier to maintain a fix, and people can now see further behind the very front to strike at other people's supply lines, their medical facilities, and their troops that are forming up. But each side is now also coming up with ways to try and push back that surveillance. That's what we mean by the battle and over transparency.
Can you also explain the importance of dominating the electromagnetic spectrum, something that Russia is very good at, but just start by explaining what that is exactly?
Yes. Okay. This is where you'll get a non-technical description from a non-technical expert. But the electromagnetic spectrum is, largely speaking, how do you communicate and sense? So radar, radio communications, microwaves, essentially anything where you're manipulating energy to do something. And this matters because, of course, command and control is a huge part of organizing your forces, both preparing them at a large scale. Where are they? How you situated them? How are you informing them with intelligence? And also coordinating them at the tactical level in terms of when an assault is underway or when under assault. Do you know where the enemy is? Do you know what they're doing? Can you find them? Can you fix them, which is essentially about tracking them or preventing them from moving? And then can you strike them? And because of the increasing use, the increasing density of sensors on the battlefield, controlling the electromagnetic spectrum is important because it's both used for sensing and also controlling those devices. I think the example that most people are familiar with is that electronic warfare, that is interfering with, jamming, or otherwise spoofing each side's communications, means that the radio control, the remote control of small airborne drones has become increasingly difficult. That's why we've seen this move to fiber optic cables. So the controller is literally running a cable very, very fine that can be 15, 20, maybe even more kilometers long. And that means there's no radio signal to be interfered with. There is a cable. You can try and track the cable. You can interfere with the cable. But you can't jam that through the use of an external jamming capability. And so if you control the electromagnetic spectrum or can disrupt your adversaries, then you can do things that both disrupt their ability to coordinate, but also directly affect their weapons systems. Precision weapons, their sensors can be jammed. Their ability to navigate or locate themselves can be jammed, and that means they become less accurate.
And entering the defense ministry in Ukraine now, we have Mikhailo Fedorov as the new defense minister. He has a technological background and digital background. He's appointed another leading expert in drones and electronic warfare as an advisor. And that person's immediate brief is to find solutions to Russian strike and reconnaissance UAVs, unmanned aerial vehicles. How much of an impact could this make?
I mean, it could be very significant. I mean, we should say that the Ukrainian forces have been tremendously innovative in a number of areas. And so it's not as if this is a brand new development, but he brings with him a particular mindset. I think it won't just be on the equipment. And this is important when we're looking at what is often characterized as a technological battle in Ukraine. It is also how equipment is used, tactics, techniques, the doctrine that goes into them, i.e. the lessons on best practice, how people are trained, but also how those capabilities are updated, developed, and bought, procurement. And so it's possible that he will bring with him a lot of expertise from his previous government roles and his knowledge of industry to look at the totality of how the Ukrainians are approaching the development of their capabilities, as well as recruitment and training of people. So I think there's significant potential. I think we should recognize that the Russians are doing something similar at the level at which they fight. So we often characterize the Russians as sort of unsophisticated, these large-scale infantry attacks, massive casualties because of the meat grinder that they throw their personnel into. I think we need to be careful blanketing that judgment across Russian forces. The Russian Air Force has learned a lot about how it targets and how it speeds up that targeting process to provide more support to the front line. Russian drone forces have developed significantly in terms of how they use those forces, how they share that information, how they develop those capabilities, and their own electronic warfare. They are very capable in many of these regards, and the Ukrainians know that. So I think we mustn't characterize the entirety of the Russian machinery as somehow wholly unsophisticated. They learn too.
And what about the Ukrainian military, though? How far has it come in transitioning from the Soviet era model to NATO style?
There's a fair amount of criticism of the Ukrainian system, and when we do that, we need to recognise the fact they are trying to transform whilst in the middle of an existential fight. And they do have some issues with their command and control system. They are playing around with how they organize recruitment and mobilization, how they train those people, which is as much about, can you marry them up with the equipment? Do you know where they're going? How are units rotated away from the front so that they can be rebuilt? And then how many levels of command are there, and how much activity is centralized as to how much is decentralized? And there are tensions pulling in both directions. So I think some people are familiar with the points system, through which individual brigades effectively tally up and provide evidence of what they are striking and what they're hitting and what casualties they've inflicted. And as you accrue more points, you basically get prioritized for new equipment and financial support. Now that sounds perhaps a little like the gamification of war, but what it does is it's created some metrics, ways to measure impact, and it also means that success begets success. At the same time, because brigades, in order to create greater speed of local innovation, have set up their own contractual arrangements with Ukrainian industry, it means that the development of the Ukrainian force isn't uniform. Different brigades might be developing at different rates. There is more or less success at sharing those lessons. And that means if you move a brigade around, it might be operating alongside other forces with which it is no longer compatible, or they have a different style of operation. And so there is a genuine difficult decision to be made about how much you let run and be very, very flexible, and how much you try and centralize. And, a lot of their senior officers are actually former Soviet or received former Soviet training, alongside many who are, have a very different attitude. But that doesn't mean that one side is right and one side is wrong in how they approach it. So they are still trying to transform, and to do so under enormous pressure. And I think NATO militaries, Western militaries, can help them on that score, but we have a great deal to learn from them, as much as they have to learn from us.
And you mentioned earlier that at the moment, the Russian military, the troops that are being lost, are being able to be replaced. The numbers are still there. A report by that report I mentioned earlier by the Centre for Strategic and International Studies says that Russia has suffered more losses than any other major power in any war since World War II. What do you think that actually means, though, for the quality of soldiers that are being sent to the front line by Russia?
It's hugely variable, and as much as obviously there are some issues on the Ukrainian side where they are taking civilians and accelerating them through training, some of which is provided by the West, like that of the UK on under Operation Interflex. On the Russian side, it appears that very many of their people are getting the most basic training, very patchy provision of equipment, and they're also pushing injured or unwell personnel back into the front line in some of these assault forces where the quality is incredibly low. But as I said, there are other parts of the Russian forces which are a bit more privileged, particularly those associated with the drone operators, where there is a high degree of training and a lot of sharing lessons. So they too have a very uneven force, and they are increasingly bringing in overseas, if you like, volunteers, but it turns out that in many cases that they've been tricked into serving. I think we've seen stuff recently about people coming in from Africa who suddenly find themselves on the front line. Um, it's it's a lot of different tricks to basically deal with their own personnel issues.
The British Prime Minister is currently in China on a trade visit. President Xi says Britain and China must rise above their differences. And there are pretty big differences over Ukraine when you consider reports, and you mentioned it earlier, of China providing Russia with components or support for its missiles and its Shahed drones. How can China be persuaded, do you think, to stop supporting Russia and stop the war?
Well, I mean, I think we've been through various bouts, particularly early on, of trying to use China as pressure on Russia. I think that is, in truth, a bit of a forlorn hope. It's in Chinese interests to develop, to a degree, a Russian dependency. There is a reverse relationship which has come out, which is that there are certain areas of the Chinese military industrial complex which don't have the same experience as parts of the Russian system, and therefore they are very keen to get that knowledge in return. There has been, as I think a RUSI commentary reported, some evidence that the Russians have been providing advice on tactics and concepts that the Chinese have begun to incorporate into their training with half an eye on Taiwan. So that relationship is one of mutual benefit, although I would say in the long term, disproportionate benefit to the Chinese over the Russians. I think the idea that we will persuade them to cut it is probably grasping at straws. The best that can happen is that there is enforcement of sanctions. I think some of the economic pressure, which in some sectors might encourage them to prioritize broader trade rather than the supply of some things to Russia. But I think we've already seen when the US was talking about upping the pressure on the Chinese, that a lot in the West, a lot of people in the West haven't done the necessary preparation. And therefore, the second that, for example, rare earths look like being under threat in terms of export from China, the US modified its stance. And so I think we are not in a great position to be able to exert significant pressure to persuade. It's going to have to be more rigorous enforcement on sanctions.
And just finally, Matthew, when you think back to 2022, when you were working with the operations and crisis team in the wake of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, could you have ever envisaged that the war would still be going on today and the global consequences that it's brought about?
I think the big change in perception that we had from where we started to where we are now is that the view before the invasion was that there would be some kind of ongoing conflict, but that it was quite likely that the Russians would succeed in getting to Kyiv, that the government in Ukraine would have to relocate, and what you would have then was a new, if you like, line of contact, similar to that of 2014 onwards in the Donbass, with more of the country under Russian control, and then, if you like, an ongoing guerrilla campaign with a sort of rump conventional force trying to hold the line, and that's the big change in terms of how much Ukrainian resistance slowed the Russians down, and then international support was able to get them to stabilize and indeed push the Russians back. Of course, we've gone through a couple of other changes. Was that there have been brief moments of optimism when it looked like the Russian front might collapse in the latter part of 2022. And again, I don't think anybody then thought that the Russians were going to be expelled from Ukraine, but there was hope that the large majority of the 2022 incursion would be ejected. And of course, we've ended up somewhere where we split the difference. I mean, I think that CSIS report and work from the Institute for the Study of War illustrate just what we actually mean by what Russian control, if you can call it that, looks like. There is resistance activity, incidentally, in those areas. But they controlled, I think it was around 10 or 8% of Ukrainian territory with their enclaves in the Donbass. Their brief incursion, which came right up to the outskirts of Kyiv, significantly expanded that. But once they collapsed backwards in the summer of 2022, they ended up with just under 20% of Ukraine under their forces. I hesitate to say control. Well, they've managed to eke that up to just over 20%. So they have increased in the past couple of years their control of Ukrainian territory by a grand total of 1.5% or maybe 2%. Now, that is still thousands and thousands of square kilometers. It is very many towns and cities either controlled or depopulated and smashed and damaged. But it's also astonishingly slow by historic standards, as that CSIS report set out. So I think it's a great reminder that war has a logic of its own once it's underway. And when you unleash it, it's very difficult to predict what will actually happen. So we've at various points tried to cast forward. I also think the other lesson is the West and Ukraine have agency. This is not inevitably heading one way or another. There are things that Europe and the US can do to help Ukraine make this a better outcome for them.
Matthew Savill, it's great speaking to you. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for watching Frontline with me, Kate Chabot. For more on the war in Ukraine, please subscribe to this channel. And for the latest news and updates, you can also head over to the Times' YouTube channel. You can also read the latest on thetimes.com. And remember, if you want exclusive updates and content, sign up for a membership right here. For now, though, thanks for watching.